Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving straight into the incredibly complex realities of income inequality, poverty, and the philosophies of wealth distribution. It is so easy to get totally lost in the political rhetoric when discussing who has what. But today, we're going to strip all that away and rely strictly on the data and the foundational economic principles. Before we get into the modern numbers, let's take a step back. Poverty has always been a gritty, deeply human issue. For most of human history, severe inequality was just an accepted fact of life, something you'd see every day on crowded, bustling streets. Today, however, we actually have precise metrics to analyze it, understand its root causes, and debate how to address it structurally. So, here's our roadmap for today. Measuring the income gap, looking beyond those raw numbers, unpacking the philosophical debate, and finally, looking at policies to actually reduce poverty. Let's get right into it. Starting off with Section 1, measuring the income gap. When economists look at the big picture, they like to line up every family in the economy by income and divide them into 5 equal groups. We call these quintiles. Looking at the data from 2014, the bottom quintile was making $29,100 or less, while the top quintile pulled in over $129,000. And here's the kicker. The top group possesses more than 13 times the total income share of the bottom group. That is a massive, highly unequal distribution right out of the gate. Let's anchor our discussion on one specific number, 14.8%. Back in 2014, that was the chunk of the U.S. population falling below the absolute poverty line. That line is basically a hard income floor set by the federal government based on family size. Fall below it, and you're officially living in poverty. But that rate hasn't been static. Over half a century, there have been some pretty wild shifts. Between 1959 and 1973, the poverty rate actually plummeted from over 22% down to a low of 11.1%. Why? Well, massive general economic growth essentially lifted the baseline for everyone in the economy. It's just like JFK's famous line, "A rising tide lifts all boats." Because the poverty line is an absolute metric, not a relative one, a growing economy naturally pushes more folks above that threshold over time. Of course, poverty doesn't just hit everyone equally. The demographics tell a pretty stark story. Poverty is heavily correlated with certain variables. Race is a major one, with Black and Hispanic populations historically facing rates more than doubled out of the white population. Age is another, hitting children incredibly hard. And family composition? It's huge. Single mother households are roughly 5 times as likely to live in poverty compared to married couple families. Moving on to Section 2. Beyond the raw numbers. Here's the thing, though. Those standard measurements, they have some pretty major blind spots. First off, they totally ignore in-kind transfers. We're talking about non-cash government help like food vouchers or Medicaid. Because standard data only looks at cash income, it artificially inflates the poverty rate. Then you've got the economic life cycle. Think about it. A college student makes barely anything, a 50-year-old is at their peak earning potential, and a retiree's income drops back down. That is just the natural progression of life, not necessarily some deep sign of systemic inequality. We also really need to distinguish between a temporary setback and a long-term reality. Let's say a Florida orange grower loses their whole crop to a freak frost. Their income totally tanks for a year, but they can dip into their savings to keep up their lifestyle. Their permanent income, meaning their normal average income over time, stayed exactly the same. If we actually measure what people consume, which reflects that permanent income, the true gap in living standards is way smaller than a single year's tax return might suggest. And that perfectly sets up the concept of economic mobility. When you really dig into it, the poor and the rich aren't just static, unchanging groups year after year. Mathematically, persistent poverty is actually pretty rare. Over a typical 10-year stretch, fewer than 3% of families stay below the poverty line for 8 or more of those years. Folks are constantly moving up and down the economic ladder, whether that's through hard work, a career pivot, or just plain old luck. All right, let's get into Section 3, the philosophical debate. First on deck is utilitarianism, backed by heavyweights like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. For them, it's all about utility, which basically translates to happiness or satisfaction. They lean hard on the idea of diminishing marginal utility. It makes sense, right? An extra dollar means the absolute world to someone struggling to buy groceries, but it barely registers for a millionaire. So their math says that taking a dollar from the super rich and giving it to the poor increases the total overall happiness of society.
But even utilitarians know there's a catch, famously known as the leaky bucket analogy. When you heavily tax the rich to pay the poor, you risk distorting incentives. If people keep less of what they earn, they might just decide to work less, which shrinks the total income of society. It's literally like trying to carry water to a thirsty person using a bucket full of holes. You are always going to lose some efficiency along the way. Because of those leaks, a utilitarian government will actually stop well short of demanding 100% perfect equality. Next up, we have liberalism, primarily shaped by the philosopher John Rawls. Rawls poses a really fascinating thought experiment. He asks us to imagine designing the rules of society from behind a veil of ignorance. Basically, you have no idea if you'll be rich, poor, incredibly talented, or totally untalented. Rawls argues that out of sheer self-protection, you design a system prioritizing the maximum criterion, maximizing the minimum utility. You would build the strongest possible safety net for the absolute poorest, basically buying social insurance just in case you end up at the bottom. And then we have libertarianism, which flips the whole script. Philosopher Robert Nozick argues that society doesn't earn income, individuals do. Libertarians care about the process, not the final outcome. Think of it like grades in a classroom. If the grading rubric is fair and nobody cheats, the final mix of A's, C's, and F's is totally just, even if it's super unequal. For a libertarian, as long as the rules of the economic game are fair and opportunities are equal, the government has absolutely zero moral right to step in and redistribute wealth.
Looking at this side-by-side comparison, it's fascinating how differently these three moral philosophies approach optimizing our resources. Utilitarianism is chasing maximum total happiness while keeping an eye on that leaky bucket. Liberalism wants to raise the absolute floor with heavy redistribution as social insurance. And libertarianism, it's all about ensuring a fair process and completely opposes redistribution, focusing solely on equality of opportunity. Which brings us to Section 4, policies to actually reduce poverty.
So the million-dollar question we face when executing these policies is this: how on earth do we redistribute wealth to help those in desperate need without totally breaking the incentives that keep our economic engine running?
To try and strike that balance, governments use a few specific tools. You've got welfare programs like temporary assistance for needy families, targeted at folks with specific, demonstrated needs. Then there are negative income taxes, like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which actively boost the paychecks of low-wage workers to encourage them to stay in the workforce. And of course, minimum wage laws designed to set a hard baseline for the price of labor. Together, these pieces form the overarching safety net meant to catch folks before they fall through the cracks. But there's always a trade-off. Push too aggressively for equality, and you can accidentally discourage people from working. Think about it. If a welfare program immediately cuts off your benefits the second you get a job, you're essentially being penalized for working. That can trap people in a cycle of poverty. We are right back to that leaky bucket problem. The more aggressively we push for perfect equality, the more we risk seriously damaging the overall efficiency of the whole economy.
And you know, these aren't just abstract numbers on a spreadsheet or fun philosophical thought experiments. They represent a very real, very messy, ongoing human struggle. Every modern society is constantly trying to walk this tightrope, balancing fairness and compassion on one side with economic progress and efficiency on the other. It's exactly what John Rawls reminds us of here. True objectivity is incredibly hard. When we look at how society is structured, it is so easy to advocate for the rules that benefit our own current standing, whether we're sitting in the top 1% or struggling in the bottom quintile. True justice requires us to step totally outside of our own biases. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on. If you were born tomorrow, entirely behind that veil of ignorance, with absolutely no idea if you'd land in the highest tax bracket or the absolute lowest, which philosophy would you want running the system? Would you pick the safety net of the liberal, the maximum utility of the utilitarian, or the pure, unhindered opportunity of the libertarian? Keep questioning the data and keep learning.